Today, our topic is on collaboration in case notes, co-constructing records with young people with Ashley Woodvine. Ashley is a Frontline Fellow, having completed the Frontline programme in 2023. She is currently a social worker in London, working in the Children's Looked After team. And without further ado, I will hand over to Ashley, who's going to deliver our session today. Welcome, Ashley.
Thank you. So yeah, as Ross said, this presentation is based on research that was produced for my Frontline dissertation while I was an ASYE social worker. So I was asked to think about an element of my practice which didn't align with my values. So for some context, I worked and still work in a looked after children's team. And previous to that, I had been a student within a leaving care team. So I work with children who will have experience of being long-term looked after and experience of corporate parenting. And also when I was in the leaving care team, I had experienced the process of young people requesting access to their records. So I thought about values that I held around transparency and collaboration, and how that these didn't really seem to figure into my practice around case recording. So I wasn't seeking to work collaboratively in this area. I wasn't really even talking about it as an activity. So my research really considered why this was and what was holding me back from working in a values aligned way. So my starting point was really a literature review around case recording and what it is. So what is case recording? So this quote here from Miller and Barry is really the most common perception of case recording found in the literature. You know, it's an onerous task. It's the last thing on your list to do. It's a bureaucratic burden. And ultimately, it's a way of capturing information about the work rather than the work itself. You know, it's the office-based task we do when we get back from that meaningful work that we do with young people. So why do we do it then? Why do we capture this information? So I found really two key themes of why we do it. So firstly is this one around what I've termed defensive practice. So this sort of like half truism, I suppose, from Wilson here around if it didn't get recorded, then it never got done in the first place, will be something that's familiar to a lot of you who are social workers. So, you know, as social workers, we make really difficult decisions for children and families that affect their lives. And we need a way of justifying those decisions, of evidencing a rationale around why we did what we did, and case records can figure into that. We also have professional standards to keep timely, detailed records, and these are audited by our local authority in a way that really measures our performance as both an individual employee and as a member of our team. So I think these perceived functions don't really lend themselves to us naturally thinking about case recording as an activity that could be shared or collaborated on with young people. It's really figured as a professional solo part of the work where we give our opinion and our, you know, our perspective on a young person's circumstances from a position that is bound up in our authority and our assessment of risk as a social worker. However, I also think from the literature we can see that this perspective on case recording is complicated by the idea of case records as narratives. So I worked from this definition from Askland and Payne, which immediately introduces the idea that a case record is a narrative. It's a type of story written by the social worker. However, they also draw a really interesting distinction between the writer of a case record and the author of a case record. And an author can be a much broader term that allows for multiple people to be authors of case records, including the client base, the service user, you know, in my case, the young person themselves. They are already collaborative authors of case records, and this is for two reasons. Firstly, we have a social relationship with the young person that we work with, and that influences the words that we use to describe them or what we deem relevant about them to write down. And secondly, because we hold them in mind as we write, we think about them as a potential future audience. You know, in my local authority, we have a training where we are really asked to think of the young person sort of standing over our shoulders as we write, and really hold them in mind continuously as we think about the case records. So this introduces kind of constructionist view of case records that is echoed here by Dole and Lawson, where the social worker who writes the record, they're not recording absolute truth, but they're recording their perspective on something that they're also part of. You know, they're an actor in these interactions, as Dole and Lawson put it. So how do we record our interactions and our interventions? Cynically, perhaps we record them in a way that makes us look good, that draws out the best aspects of our practice, but also we record them in a way that's easy for us to sort of get down quickly. We use professional jargon and acronyms so that we can make case recording a small part of our work and leave more time for the work that we find more meaningful. So given this view of case records as narratives, what I did in my project was turn to narrative theory to consider how I can bring my practice more in line with the values of transparency and collaboration that I had identified. So a narrative approach to social work really has three dominant themes. So firstly, it is an approach which seeks to break down a dominant discourse, so a commonly held story about a person, which is typically singular and unchallenged, and seek to widen the narrative and break free of this problem-saturated story and introduce new ideas which are perhaps more strength-based or just curious in their perspectives in attending to things that we hadn't really considered before. And lastly, it's an approach which will seek to amplify the voice of the child in the narratives that we tell and really make room for them to tell some of their own stories about their lives. So what did I do? So I took case records that I had written about young people prior to my research starting, and I sat down with the young people that I wrote about and I sought their feedback. You know, I printed them off and we went through these records together so that I could seek their perspectives on what they liked and what they didn't like. And I found these sort of key findings from that part of my research. So firstly, they really had a limited awareness around case recording as a practice. Even sort of older teenagers that I worked with really had very little sense that social workers were going back to the office and writing up these visits. They didn't really think about it and they were surprised to hear about it. Secondly, they didn't understand jargon. So every time I had used a piece of professional language or an acronym, a young person had to seek clarity from me about what that meant. So terms like TAC and grab pack and things like that, I think figured into my case notes, and young people were like, what does that mean? And even when you explain, oh, you know, it's an acronym, it stands for Team Around the Child meeting, they're like, well, why do you have those meetings? So it really, it opened up new discussions about the professional role. Generally, young people seem to prefer narrative, long form style records rather than sort of bullet points broken down by theme, but they didn't always have style preferences. So one young person I worked with preferred the record that I showed her where I'd written it to her, whereas others preferred it when they were referred to in the third person. Really dominantly, what I found was that young people queried hypotheses that I had written down but not put to them in the moment. So things like, oh, I wonder if so-and-so was thinking about this when they told me this, or whether this thing that had happened played into how they were today. And one young person in particular really jarred against that and said, why didn't you just say that to me in the moment? You know, we could have spoken about it. I don't think I did feel like this. So that was a key area of challenge that I encountered when I was sharing case records. And what young people did like is when they felt that I had recognised and recorded what they had said. So not necessarily like verbatim quotes, but when they felt that I had authentically represented how they felt about a situation and what they told me. So what I struggled to do, however, was move from this part of my project where I was reviewing case notes and move to the co-constructing aspect of my project, which I had imagined as writing records together. So I found I was able to sort of deconstruct narratives with young people, but struggled to move to a more generative place. And I was also finding that young people just seemed less interested in this part of my project, didn't really want to take part in it. And this made me worry about a risk of oppressive practice. So some young people might find it empowering to take a direct authorial role in their case records, but for some, it might be a really difficult reminder of the state influence in their lives and the sort of duties that social workers have to perform. And I didn't want to put that on them, and I was finding that actually they weren't particularly interested in doing that. So what I did was, when I went back and analysed my sessions where I had just been going through previously written records with young people, I found that co-construction was already happening. I'd imagined quite a narrow view of what co-construction should be, which was really like putting pen to paper together. But my research had already led to co-construction at the level of meaning, because me and the young people were coming together and developing a shared understanding about our interactions and what they meant. So I found this in two cases. So firstly, what I had mentioned on the previous slide about really challenging why I wrote certain things, hypotheses that I had written and not named, or hypotheses I had named where they thought, actually, I thought you got that wrong. And this led to sort of more in-depth conversations about the differences in our perspectives, which allowed us to sort of come together and hash it out in a way that challenged my perspective as a worker. And secondly, I found that when young people were reviewing previously written case notes, they might return to conversations that we'd had quite briefly, and it led to more reflective conversations that were richer in detail. So one young person had looked at a record that I had written where I had made mention of a brief conversation we'd had about her placement not being a cultural match. And she was like, oh, I remember that. And when we returned to it, it led to a much richer conversation about race and identity and what that meant to her in the context of her foster placement. So what did I learn and what lessons can we take from this research around case recording? So I think when it comes to transparency, sharing my work only really acknowledged the fact that young people already play an authorial role. Sharing it only enhances that. And I found that actually once I had started being transparent about case recording, it became much easier. Previously it was something I felt maybe quite shy about or quite anxious about, but that very quickly went away, and I found that it was a very good way of doing relationship-based work, was to share these records and talk about them together. It was also a way that allowed me to be accountable about the language I used and the perspectives that I prioritized in a way that was challenging and practice improving. In terms of collaboration, again, the act of sharing and negotiating what was good and bad in my case records, it showed a willingness on my part, I think, to understand the person's perspective and take it seriously. And it also demonstrated to that young person that I really regarded them as a capable partner, somebody who was able to tell their own story, who had the best understanding of their experiences and their life, and really held them as somebody who could enhance my knowledge of them and what I wrote. It broke down perhaps what we'd seen earlier, this view of case records as a professional activity where the social worker writes from a position of authority. Being collaborative in the way that I was really broke that down in a way that I valued. And finally, I think what I learned was that co-construction is ultimately about meaning and not necessarily the written output. So case notes can reflect collaborative work that you do in coming alongside a young person, making meaning together by attending to their perspectives, and maybe even saying to them, I'm going to write about this, what do you think today? Rather than sitting there together and sort of producing something that you can then put on the file. So yeah, that's the end of my presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions that you have. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. That was really interesting presentation. I think for me, just in terms of the people that are listening, if you're able to put any questions into the chat, then I can put them to Ashley. So feel free, anything you're curious about or you want maybe Ashley to explore a little bit more, then put the questions in the chat. From my perspective, I think what was interesting was that you've taken a task that every social worker or lots of professionals have to do as a professional role, and you've kind of really explored that. And I think the power of what you put across there, that this idea of kind of a constructed or co-constructed meaning, I think is really interesting. You touched a little bit on kind of feeling vulnerable in terms
Mm.
of that process. Has that have Was that an initial feeling, or is that something that you've been able to kind of work through and kind of, you know, how did you work through that sense of, I'm gonna, put my written work to a young person, and what that might lead to? How did you work through that?
Yeah, I think it was mostly an initial feeling because it felt like you were sharing something that was quite private or that perhaps you shouldn't be sharing. You know, we think about young people being able to access their records when they turn 18. So it felt like quite a different way of working to share records with a 13-year-old, for instance, and have that immediate interaction. So I suppose I was thinking about, well, which records do I share? And I had to work through some of that like self-filtering, I suppose, of, oh, do I want to share this record? Do I want to share this one instead? And what that sort of meant, that was part of the research that I didn't really touch on in the presentation. But what I found was I felt far less vulnerable in doing that once I sat down with the young people, especially when I realized that they didn't have much of a sense at all that this was an activity that social workers did. Then it felt like I had to be more explanatory and more honest and sort of put my feelings of vulnerability aside, because for young people it was much more important to explain exactly why social workers have to write these things. And I think it led to quite frank conversations about, what it means for a young person to be in care, even, and the fact that we have to perform these professional duties. I remember one conversation with a young person that really focused on that. um, and that wasn't something that I expected to have to do as part of this research. But yeah, so I suppose my initial feelings of vulnerability went away quite quickly, and I found that that was quite revealing in terms of this value around transparency and why I was resistant to it at first. That fell away quite quickly.
Mm. I think it is really interesting to reflect on, you do work with a young person, and they don't understand there's an aspect of your role. Do you know what I mean? And
Mm,
and that we obviously often privilege conversation, don't we? But obviously the kind of the written word and the written meaning attached to that is equally important. So really interesting. So I've got a question just to put to you. Um, and it's from Anusha. Um, so, just thinking about organizationally, what has been the response to your work? Has it been received well? Had case recording been previously discussed in your team as something that needed consideration or enhancing?
so I think on a colleague to colleague level, it's something that people have been interested in, and found that it's brought a new perspective to how they think about case recording. But I don't think it's something that, well, perhaps this is for me to consider. I haven't really brought it to the team as a whole, and I think partly that's because there's always an organisational feeling of case recording being something that is time consuming and goes on the back burner. So often I think for a lot of my colleagues, the idea of thinking about case recording in a new way feels really draining, because it's like, well, I'm struggling to even just get anything up on the system to record my visits. I don't really want to have to think more deeply about what I'm writing and why. So I think that's really something for the future. If I was to take this research to my local authority, reframing how we think about case records in the first place, I think would be the starting point, and that might be quite a challenging thing to do on an organisational level.
Mm. So have you just kind of used it more to kind of an individual basis to develop those relationships with young people, and kind of, or have you, I mean, there's a
Yeah.
question really in terms of, have you been able to continue this kind of collaboration with young people, like post research? Have you been able to do that?
Yeah, I have done. So not so much in the sharing of the records in and of themselves. So I have done that on the odd occasion when I've wanted to seek like clarity. Oh, I wrote this. Was this right? Like, been thinking about it a bit more. Like, did that feel true to you, or have I got this wrong? But I think what it's encouraged me to do more is the naming of those things that I'm going to write in the moment. So rather than going away and sort of writing about my curiosity in private while I'm writing on the system, I've been able to be more honest in the moment with young people and think, oh, I'm actually thinking about this. You know, do you think that's true? So I think it's created a greater level of candidness, perhaps in my interactions with young people.
So that kind of, you said that it was noted that you kind of written a hypothesis. There was a feeling that you hadn't. They would have maybe preferred you to share that with them in the moment. So that's one
Yeah.
thing that you've moved forward. What about in terms of, you mentioned in your research about accurately kind of their voice being amplified or accurately kind of recorded, and they really valued that. Has that influenced how you record now in terms of trying to actively put their voice more into your recording?
Yeah, so I really try, and it's hard because of time pressures, but I really try and not do brief bullet pointed case notes, where I used to write a lot of my case notes sort of broken down by topic. So education, health, here are the things that we briefly touched on. I really try and not do that now, and instead sort of write a case record chronologically from beginning to end. These are the conversations we had, record as much as I can remember about the exact words that young people used and the feelings that they expressed about certain topics, because that really seemed to be the thing that they valued. You know, young people would read the case notes and be like, yes, I remember that, or yes, that was true. They liked it when it felt like they were seen and heard in the record.
Okay. No, thank you for that. I mean, is there anything else in terms of, that you feel you've really taken from this and applied to your practice? You're saying that the idea of sharing hypothesis is more something you're more conscious of in your conversations. Is there anything else that's kind of come about as a result of, this kind of project?
Um, I suppose it's just made me think more about how this really needs to be approached on an individual basis, and how I think there's a lot. Social workers are being asked more and more to think about the impact of the case records that they write, and you're hearing more and more, care leavers sharing quite hurtful experiences they've had of gaining access to their records and reading
Mm.
things that were written about them that were phrased insensitively or that were inaccurate. But what I also found is that it's really, really personal in terms of how young people like to be written about. I mentioned that one young person much preferred it when they were written to, whereas others didn't. They felt that that seemed a bit unnatural. So I think it's about being honest with young people from the outset that you do write about them, and asking, how would you prefer to be written about? I think that's really important. But I also had to be honest with my young people that this isn't standard practice, this isn't something that all social workers do. So I think there was a sense of preparing young people for the fact that when they do gain access to their records, if that's something they choose to do, it might be an experience that can be hurtful, and that they would need good support from whoever is around them at the time to go through those records.
I think it's interesting though. I think, like reflecting on the fact that young people might not understand the process, that the almost professional social process, and then empowering them to be a part of understanding that. And then,
Mm.
you're actively saying that you would have conversations with a young person to say, well, part of my role is to record our conversations, and I want you to be part of helping me to do that in the best way for you. I'm wondering if that might be something, I couldn't imagine any local authorities having an issue with that aspect in terms of being
Mm.
good practice and including a young person. But just a reflection from LSO. She says, not a question, but I really like this reframe of case recording as something useful. Obviously they always are, but we don't often have discussions that explore their meaning and value more deeply. So she really appreciates the information and the presentation.
Great, thank
And
you.
just a question in terms of, I suppose, a bit more broadly, but what advice might you have for a social worker wanting to build this into their role or into their practice?
I think really, Ella's reflection actually would be the starting point for that. I think I really had to challenge myself to think about case records as something that that could be really valuable for my practice, and break down that dichotomy that I presented at the beginning of my talk around case records are sort of about the real work, they're not the real work. And I think challenging that perspective, it can be difficult, but it is essential, because these are things that young people will be left with long after you stop working with them. So they are an important part of the work. I think being a little more mindful, or perhaps even building in more time around thinking about how you're going to write up your records rather than doing it as a last priority, as much as you're able to, it can make the activity of case recording feel more meaningful as a social worker, and ultimately be more meaningful for the young person if they do choose to access those records in the future.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think I think it's a really powerful kind of reframe, and I think something for social workers to reflect on. I think that you're right. That first point is to think, okay, well, how can I really use every part of my role to enhance the relationship and the understanding?
Yeah.
And I think it's sometimes interesting that you can come away from a conversation and you may think one thing and record one thing, but the young person may come away and think something else. So how much can we potentially use our own records and check in for that understanding to then develop a better relationship? I think is an interesting way to think about it. I don't know if you've got any more thoughts on that in terms of anything else that you've taken from this and that you kind of held on to in your practice.
Yeah, I think what you've just said about the differences of perspective, I'm definitely more attentive now to clarifying meaning from my young people. So previously I might have not, like, they might have said something that I didn't particularly understand, but perhaps, you know, we were coming to the end of a visit, or perhaps they'd expressed it a few times and I felt like I couldn't really get to the core of that meaning. I'm much more inquisitive, I suppose, now, about being like, what does that mean though? Break that down for me. Can you put it in a different way to make sure that I really understand what you mean? Because I suppose I'm thinking about recording their perspective accurately, but it also just enhances our relationship on one level, because I'm being very interested and inquisitive about what they are saying and what they mean by that and their perspective. But also, it's just, in the broader sense, it allows you to do better work, because your interventions in the future can then be far more targeted if you have a really detailed understanding of what your young people mean in what they're telling you.
Yeah, great. I totally agree. I just want to say thank you so much for today, Ashley, in terms of your presentation. I think it's really explored an area of practice that everyone will have to do, and I suppose that kind of reframing it in a different way, in that co-construction of meaning, it's certainly been really interesting. So thank you so much for today's presentation.